Welcome to Promo Insiders, the ASI media podcast that covers the topics that matter most to the promotional products industry. I'm C.J. Mittica, and in this episode, we're continuing our annual tradition of reviewing the most interesting findings from Counselor's 2024 State of the Industry report. I'm joined by ASI Senior Executive Research Director Nate Kucsma to go over the top products and markets, as well as other major findings from our survey. So Nate, maybe someone's new to the promotional products industry, or maybe they've just been living under a rock for the past, 40 years. Can you tell our audience, if they're not familiar with the State of the Industry report, what it is and why it's important?
Yeah, it's what I would consider to be, and I think most people in the industry would consider to be the most comprehensive report on the promotional products industry in North America. It's done on a yearly basis. We have been putting this study out. I found, when I was going through the archives celebrating Counselor's 70th anniversary this past year, that dated back 40 to 50 years, right? So we've been doing this study for a long time. As I know is true for you, have not been around for the entire length of the SOI, but this is the 11th SOI I've worked in. I started at ASI in 2014 in March, right at the time when the study starts to really hit its stride. So over the 11 years, we've certainly been through a lot. We've been through a little mini recession, I guess you could say. We've been through a pandemic. We've seen ups and downs, but it really is a study that focuses on both distributors and suppliers' businesses and really allows people to understand how the industry is doing. But then I consider it to be even more important than that, to be able to benchmark where they are and to really take a moment to evaluate where their business is and how their business is doing. When people take these surveys, and this issue and the findings in here are based on our member surveys, I often hear from people when they take these surveys that it does give them a chance to actually evaluate their business in a way that they normally wouldn't. As small business owners, we like to think that people would, but they don't necessarily. So this survey gives them a chance to actually level set themselves. And then we take all of these results, put them together, total them up, aggregate them, and your incredible team does a great job of giving life to the numbers. And that's what this is. I highly recommend that after this, and after people listen to this and review this presentation, you go online and you review the full issue because it's incredible.
Thank you for saying that, Nate. Really appreciate that. Of course, we can't do it without your numbers and your research, of course. But so if people do want to see the full report and the entire State of the Industry issue, if you receive Counselor in print, you should have received it in your mailboxes already. If not, you can go online to www.stateoftheindustry.com. That will take you right to our coverage. We have over, I think, a dozen articles of aggregating hundreds of stats, reporting on some of the biggest issues. And what we're showing today is just a sampling of what's in that issue. We're just going to pick out some interesting findings, some of the highlights. So I agree with Nate. I encourage you to go online and find the full report so you can just get all the information that you need.
Yep.
So we're gonna pop through some new stuff, some old stats, but with new information, and just explain what it all means. We're first going to start with products and markets. These are probably our most highly sought after information, just to see which products sell the most and which markets are the top verticals that distributors are targeting. And just to start off with, I think this is a new stat we asked this year, Nate, the difference between the percentage of non-wearables sold versus wearables sold. And by the way, just for our audience, if you're watching on video, you're going to be able to see these stats. If not, I'll be reading out some of them. I won't be reading out everything because there's lots of stats. And just remember that all the stats you see in here, again, is in our State of the Industry coverage. And you can also, of course, email us after the fact, and we'd be happy to share this presentation with you. So here, the breakdown versus non-wearables and wearables. Non-wearables make up 54.5% of products sold versus wearables 45.5%. So again, this is a new stat for us, right?
It is. Now, we've always had this data, right? But we never thought to present it like this. Why? Sure. It's a really good question, CJ. I don't know why we didn't. But sometimes things happen over time. And what you've seen is in the industry, importance and the importance to distributors' business of wearables growing over time. It used to be that wearables might be making up about 35%, 37% of the overall business if you go back through time, maybe even a little bit less than that. And over time, what we've seen is a general step up of wearables over non-wearables, or otherwise known as like hard goods, right? So we've seen that split get much more closer to 50-50. There's still a sizable difference, right? We're still talking about $2.5 billion. Like, that's actually real money. But we've definitely seen the growth of the wearable segment, especially things like, T-shirts and headwear specifically come to mind over the past few years.
Yeah, and actually, I looked at it from a different angle. I think this will tie into the next slide. I'll show it now. Is that when you look at the top product categories, it's apparel dominant, right? Like if
Yeah,
you look here, t-shirts are number one. They've been number one for as long as I've been in the industry. Polos, caps and headwear, other wearables, these are some of the most dominant product categories. So
for
to
sure.
me, it was I guess maybe a little bit surprising that like you see the individual apparel categories like dominate the top 10, yet hard goods and non-wearables are still bigger overall than apparel as a whole.
There's a lot more of them, right? I
Yes.
think that's really what it comes down to. When you talk about the types of products that are available, there's only when you're talking about like wearable products, you're talking about polo shirts, t-shirts, headwear. Listen, there's variations in the products, right? There's different fabrics, there's different cuts, there's different overall designs, there's different imprinting methods overall. Like, there's all these differences, but fundamentally they're the same product, right? So if people want a t-shirt, they may choose that they want a wicking fabric. They may choose they want an embroidered patch, but it's still a t-shirt. When you start getting into the hard goods category, if people want a magnet, they want a magnet, right? They want any of the different variations. If they want a pen, there's all the different variations of all the different types of pens. So it's just that there's a much greater variety of very different products for hard goods, I think, than there are for the wearable segment. The wearables, like, they really do take into account. These numbers are big, but they're also very all-encompassing product categories.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Like if you think of the rise of kitting, right? If you get a kit, a new employee hire or something along those lines, there might be a wearable item in that box, but then there's also 4 or 5 different hard good items. So it's usually that you're choosing between apparel items, and even though apparel sells well overall, you're right that sometimes it's just sort of, do you want the t-shirt, do you want a polo, do you want a hoodie? It's not always all three. So
Right.
looking at this top 10 category list and sort of the products overall as a whole, is there anything else that jumps out at you?
Yeah, what I would say is that we've seen the rise of drinkware over the past couple years, right?
Yeah.
There's, and I don't want to, like, make this seem too extreme, but I feel like drinkware is one of the categories out there where there has been innovation, or at least, even if you move, and the innovation can be in a different ways, but going back, 10 years ago, right? Drinkware was, disposable cups. It was single wall aluminum bottles, right? And then what you had was the advent of some very large consumer brands that are out there now. You had this growth and all of a sudden these higher end and more status symbol types drinkware, I guess you could say. And then just in the past year, you had Stanley, which came about into this industry, which had a very, very quick transition into this industry from the consumer side. And I think that's one thing that we've also seen over the years is, if a product is hot in the consumer side of the business, the commercial side, it is transitioning over into the promo side, in the promo business much quicker than it has in the past. I think distributors are recognizing it. And I also think the companies that produce these products realize the value of it. So you see this incredible groundswell, and that's 2023. That's that 1% there. 1% of this industry is equal to about $260 million, right? That's what it is. So when you see a growth of almost 1%, that's a big jump in sales for an individual category. And I think when you look at drinkware, that's an example of where innovation really can drive a product category. I mean, going back to just 2017, it's up very nearly 50% from 2017 just to 2023.
Yeah, and so to your point, Nate, looking at drinkware in 2017, it was 7.6% of industry sales. In 2023, it was 10.7%, and that increased from 2022, where it was
Yeah.
at 9.9%. And there are people, both I've heard in ASI and in the industry, who thought we sort of reached our maximum, our peak for what drinkware could be in terms of
I think
sales.
I was one of those, CJ, just to be completely blunt. I'm pretty sure that at some point or another in the last year, you and I had a conversation where I'm like, yeah, it probably topped out at 9.9%, and I was mistaken.
Yeah, and look, we had discussions internally about what our product of the year should be, and a couple of years ago we said, should it be drinkware? Like, have we reached the apex of drinkware mania? That was 2022, and of course we were wrong. I'm glad we chose something else, because last year, just with the fascination, the fanaticism with Stanley, and that carried over into beginning of 2024. It pushed drinkware even higher, and I think you can point to Stanley primarily as one big reason that drinkware increased last year.
I think you absolutely can. I mean, and listen, I mean, from 2017 on, this has been kind of straight line growth. It's been growing every year. You have to put a big, whatever the biggest asterisk you can on 2020, only because sales were still very strong for drinkware, but PPE sales and things like that took up a growing percentage of the industry. So they took up 25% of the industry, which obviously they normally do not do. So it's been, I mean, what I would consider to be very, very significant growth of this category over the past, probably bordering on a decade now.
Yeah, and one additional point, yes, there probably is more drinkware being sold, but the price points are much higher. This used to be a more entry level category. Now it's a premium category, and you see people spending $20, $30, $40 for a tumbler, and that's certainly contributing to the increase in percentage. So now, Nate, so again, the $1 million question, we asked this last year, I'll ask it to you again this year. Is drinkware going to increase again in 2024?
So what I don't think we've seen this year is a very large new product enter into the market, right? So I do think that the Stanley in 2023 was a very big market. And by the way, just on a side note for anybody watching this, I'm looking at your cat hanging out above your head and over your right shoulder. It's just absolutely amazing, because if my dog decides to do the following, to do the duplicate on the bookshelves behind me, it's going to go bad really quickly.
Yeah, my cat likes to hang out in my office.
Oh my God,
I hope he's not distracting our viewers from our scintillating discourse. But go ahead.
He's distracting me a little bit. It's great. No, I don't. I think that we had seen the potential for maybe some growth in the market in terms of other consumer brands moving into the market. I think Awala is the one that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's a very popular brand. That inventory is the big issue. I think it's not available. It's only available through one supplier, ETS, and ETS has been telling people, "Hey, we're not getting this until spring of next year."
Right. So that's the thing. So therefore, I think what you're having is it's garnering a lot of interest in the industry, but the sales aren't there. And I think with Stanley, the sales, even though the weights would be long, the product was available eventually, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of the other more brand name products out there that are available in greater numbers. So no, if I had to put a stake in the ground right now, CJ, I would say it's not going to increase. I would think that the momentum of it's not going to slow dramatically, but I don't perceive it continuing to go up by 1% every year. I don't see that happening.
Fair. I'll say it's either going to be flat or increase very slightly, maybe at 0.1 or 2%. And we'll see next year when we come back who wins that bet.
Indeed.
One last thing. So we talked about products. Let's talk about top markets. So no major surprises here. Education and healthcare are still the clear 1 and 2, and there's not major shifts in the market, and there really haven't been since 2020. But
Yeah.
is there anything here, Nate, that you think is particularly important?
Yeah, the last major time that education wasn't number one, as you said, was 2020, and that's when
Yeah,
healthcare jumped up to number one. But even then, like they were like really like neck and neck, right? There's so
sure.
many educational institutions in North America. I mean, and this is a North American study, right? But only about 8% ish of the North American total market is in Canada, right? So it's the US and Canada. Um, so the number of education institutions in the US, but I mean, just higher education is 7,000. And then you talk about all the secondary education, all the primary education. It's such a big market that that is a market that I don't want to say is kind of recession proof, but maybe it actually kind of is.
Kind of is because it actually suffered during the pandemic. Enrollment was down. A lot of higher education institutions were struggling in some facet, and enrollments increased actually in a notable way since then. So you kind of imagine that it went through the worst and it's on the upswing again.
Yeah, it's actually kind of an interesting thing. I spent 7 years of my career working for a large education nonprofit. And and it's a fact that when the economy is not doing great, things like grad schools actually do better because people remove themselves from the
Yeah.
workforce or remove from the workforce and go back for continuing education. So actually in that ways it kind of is it's sort of a, contra industry in some cases.
Hmm.
Um, but no, I would say that here's how I would look at this and use this data if I'm a distributor. I would look at these numbers here and try to figure out, are there any major industries that are located in your area, right? In where you live that you don't have business in, right? You want to be diversified as possible because I can tell you, if you were only in hospitality back in 2020, you might not be in business right now, right? Because hospitality got absolutely crushed in 2020, with the travel, with all the dining restrictions, with everything, with people staying home. So what I would say is actually look at like the top five. Look at education, look at healthcare, look at manufacturing, look at construction, look at finance, right? And find out how much of your business do you have in that. You're not going to be in every one of these industries, right? I mean, if you are, I would love to hear from you. But probably not. But what you want to make sure is that you at least have a presence in a in a sampling of these industries in 5 or 6 of them, so that if one of these industries crashes, then you're going to be able to maintain. Because I mean, CJ, just in the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen finance crash, right? We've seen construction starts go down. We saw hospitality crash. Go back 20 years ago. If you had all your business in pharmaceuticals, they all of a sudden that dried up nearly overnight. So I think it's just important to look at this, realize what the biggest industries are, and make sure that you at least have a footing in them.
Yeah, and we preach diversification. You hope that people heed those lessons. We've had enough recessions and crashes to have have reminders, probably too many reminders, but just another reminder of the fact that make sure you're diversified
Yep.
with your client base. So we touched on products and markets, and now we're going to go over some KPIs. And so a lot of interesting findings here. First thing we want to bring up is just basically this how are sales doing, and we're looking at this through average order values and median number of orders. So order values went actually down for suppliers. We can talk about that a little more later because we're going to go over supplier health, and I think there's some very interesting implications to unpack there. Distributor order values were flat basically after
Mm-hmm.
2 years of growth, post pandemic.
Yep.
Meanwhile, though, the median number of orders increased a little bit overall and for certain revenue classes. So order values didn't change much for distributors, but the median number of orders were flat to up. What should we read into this for our listeners and viewers?
That overall the year was sort of almost a wash. I don't know another way to really put that, right? Like when we looked at sales last year, which was reported back in January, February of 2024, for year-end sales of 23, it was up just over 1%, right? And to be clear, the year was trending really, really strongly through Q2. January through July, where the industry was growing. It was a strong year. And then Q3 and especially Q4, which is the biggest quarter for the industry, hit. And it was, I don't want to say a bloodbath, right? Because I don't like make this seem too bad, but it was a very rough quarter. And it was a quarter that kind of was rough unexpectedly so. All right. It's one thing if you can see the train coming, but this time the train just appeared. And that's, I think, what happened. So I would say that what you would look at here is, and within this, CJ, right? It's not saying that everybody had a flat year, right? Not saying that
Sure.
everybody's year was. You had some distributors who, if they gained a couple big clients, may have been up 50%, 60%. You had others, if they lost a similar client, went down 50 or 60%. And then you had the, if you think like what a bell curve is, that's kind of how it works. But there's been times when we've had a bell curve where the industry's gone down by 10 or 15% or gone up by, 10 or 15%. That wasn't the case this year. This year was very much a story of two halves of the year, which kind of evened out and netted out to be kind of a flat year where everybody was sort of in wait and see mode. And I do feel like the first half of 24 has sort of been this kind of the same thing. When we're recording this right now, we've been through about a week of an incredibly tumultuous stock market, right?
Right.
I don't think, personally speaking, that that's a bad thing, because I think people had been waiting for something to happen, right? And normally when you wait for something to happen, it's probably not as bad as you probably imagined it. And the stock market is kind of like that. And I think that it kind of shocked everybody and made people realize, oh, like this is what I've been waiting for. I thought that was going to happen. And I think we might kind of be there now. So personally speaking, I'm a bit optimistic for Q3 and Q4 and 24. But looking back at 23, it was just kind of a very staid year.
Yeah, and that's not necessarily a terrible thing. Like if you, for example, when we tabulate the growth for the top 40 distributors and suppliers in 2022, 3/4 of those companies had double-digit growth.
Wow.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Last year it was a quarter or less, I believe, and that's just more typical of how things are. You have this 2-year period of recovery post pandemic, and in 2023 things stabilized. And yes, it was hard in the second half of the year, but it's also kind of more the way things normally are. That it's going to be a little harder just to bank runaway growth. And that's just more typical, I would say, economic and market conditions. Not saying it was easy. There's definitely a lot of difficulty to go forth, but just sort of the way that more like things normally operate.
And spoiler alert, we also do a European study, which is being released in the next month or so, looking at 23. The markets are so closely intertwined between the US and Europe, or North America and Europe. It was sort of the same thing. They had a very, very strong 2022, and then 23 hit, and everybody was like, did we forget how to grow at those rapid rates? And the answer is no, you didn't. But business conditions, very often broader business conditions, really dictate how this industry goes. And that's not only in the US, that's all over.
Yep. So, okay, we know sales were hard. How is that manifesting? Well, one of the ways is that obviously buyer behaviors are changing. Their budgets are tighter and they're ordering less. And what they're ordering is also changing as well. So we asked distributors, are clients more likely to opt for lower priced items over higher priced items than they have in the past? And I would say roughly half overall distributors. If you look at the revenue classes, smaller distributors for sure are seeing a change in the product mix of their buyers. The larger distributors, 1 million and over, you're seeing that much less. But this matches what we've heard as an editorial outfit. Buyers are gravitating towards more budget-priced options than they were in the past couple of years.
Yeah, sure. No, that's absolutely true. And I've heard that from talking to people all over the world, so to speak, right? And in the US, obviously, that's really what it comes down to. Is that you mentioned about budgets, right? Budgets have almost I feel like for the first half of the year, people have been very holding on to their budgets really, really tightly. Which fun fact can actually be not bad news for the second half of the year, because they're gonna have to spend some of those. We have to spend those budgets. But Yeah, I've spoken to suppliers who exist sort of like in the low price end of the spectrum, and they're doing great, right? They're doing,
Hmm.
I mean, they're doing great because all of a sudden they're getting more interest in orders than they have in the past. If you're in the higher end or the custom end, might be a little bit slower, might be more challenging. But like it's one thing that's kind of that has come out over the last 2 years, I would say, is when I joined this industry back in 2014, I would hear from our distributor members that if a supplier raised the cost of a pen by 2 cents, that's not hyperbole. That's actually the number that was thrown out. Then all of a sudden they would have to go find somebody else to do business with because their clients would not absorb it and they didn't want to do that. That's no longer the case. So even though you see 95% of distributors being concerned about suppliers raising their prices, right?
Yeah,
That doesn't mean that suppliers can't raise their prices if it's justified, right? They should. And that's sort of where I think we're at here is that there's been higher prices that have been absorbed in the market. Eventually, it's going to reach a point where people are going to say enough. And we may be getting close to that. That's really like a gut decision. I don't have there's no data to back that up per se. But what I would say is that there has been a, movement to lower priced items, but even those items are now becoming a little bit more expensive.
sure. Yeah, and we hear from distributors that so even though maybe buyers just are looking to get more bang for their buck, right? So you get more products at a cheaper price than spending that same budget for a few of a higher either perceived value or actually priced item. That the clients still want retail inspired brand name products and they want
Yes.
quality. They're not settling for low quality. And the trick for distributors is to balance those two, to still deliver for their clients the products that they want, but at the budget that they have.
Yep. Agreed.
And on prices, I think this falls nicely into our next section. So we're talking about suppliers and sourcing, and we talked about supplier health already, and it's an issue, and I think it's one actually that just doesn't get discussed enough. And the reason is that suppliers have gone through a lot in the past, basically the past few years, this decade, and of course distributors have too. It's not like distributors have had it easy, far from it. Suppliers have had to deal a lot in terms of supply chain turmoil, labor difficulties, wild swings in the prices of their materials, of their goods, and it's kind of came to a head. So we have two stats here that illustrate that. One, we ask suppliers, what's your top business challenge? And then remaining profitable under pressure to cut prices went from 12% to 16%. And definitely it was higher for larger suppliers. So the suppliers are feeling that pressure that distributors want them to hold the line on prices, yet,
Yeah.
how are suppliers remaining profitable? But then you look at supplier margins, the margins for suppliers actually increased in 2023. Went from 28.8% to 30.3%.
Yep.
And to me, that shows that suppliers, while they have ate a lot of the extra costs, they can't do that forever. And they can't do that forever and be able to run a successful business. So they're passing on those costs to the distributors now.
Yep. Um, so like James Carville said in Old School, that's perfect. I have nothing to add to that. Like, I mean, no, I mean it's true. It's you mentioned just finding, one of the we probe into supplier study, how challenging is it to find employees, right? And how much have you had to raise wages? And the answer is they have, and it is a challenge. And distributors don't have some of those challenges, especially if they're a smaller distributor, where they may have like one or two people in front office or back office staff, right? But it's mostly them doing the work. The employment and the supply chain issues that they're dealing with they're feeling the supply chain issues very often that the suppliers are feeling. So the suppliers really are on the front lines of that, and they've certainly had to deal with a lot. So yeah, it's going to be a problem moving forward.
And this was reflected. We asked, so we say the state of the industry report, and I'm not blowing up your spot, Nate. We field two separate reports, right? We survey distributors we survey suppliers.
Yep.
And we take those results and we combine to produce the report that you're seeing in your reading. Well, we ask suppliers, how do you rate your health? How are you doing? And is this on a 1 to 5 scale that we do this, Nate?
It is.
And inevitably, in the past couple of years, the actual ratings they give their health is lower than what they forecasted the year before. So what do we draw from that?
What do you draw from that is that this industry is always very optimistic, right? But that's not only this industry, that's every industry. Every small business owner, every business owner says, yes, I think, unless there's something really big on the horizon that they can see coming, like some sort of regulation or something, they always think it's going to be better at the beginning of the year. We're going to have a great year. We're going to do this. But with all of that said, though, what I think you have seen, especially as it relates to supplier health, is that going to 24, they're very measured about what their expectations were, right? So they were expecting their overall industry health, so to speak, to be right where 2023 ended. So what we have, CJ, is we ask people to rate it on anywhere from a 1, which is ailing, to a 5, that is robust. The worst we ever saw was in 2020 when it was down to a 2.69, right? It was a bad environment at the end of the year. And then it rebounded, and we've seen a little bit of growth. And so even when you look at this from 22 to 23, what was 3.55 to 3.5, right? That's almost the same number, right? That's very, very close. If you want to use the whole, not when political season, the whole margin of error thing, it's well within the margin of error for this. So it wasn't a statistically different year in 23 versus 22 in terms of the overall supplier health. And for 24, they're expecting kind of the same thing. And that's where, all of the movement we see in the industry in terms of sales, it's actually so far kind of borne that out, I believe, in some cases, because sales for the year, for the first 6 months of 24 have been sort of flat based on our research. And that's about what they were expecting at the beginning of the year. When you go beyond that, though, look at the differences between the overall, supplier health between the smallest suppliers, those with 1 million or less in sales, and those with the largest of over 5 million. And that obviously goes way north up to like $1 billion now, or in some cases way north of $1 billion based on recent news. The larger suppliers and the medium suppliers are doing better than the smaller suppliers. The smaller suppliers may be the ones who are feeling the need to grow their business, and they're having a hard time doing it in the current environment. That's really what that comes down to. The larger suppliers may be dealing with other challenges, such as the personnel challenges that we had mentioned earlier. We're trying to, remain profitable while being asked to cut prices. Everybody wants to grow their business, but that's not their biggest problem. For the smaller suppliers, it's often growing their business. And this is a challenging environment to do that unless you're very, very well differentiated and positioned.
Yeah, one thing I will note, though, there's an opportunity here for that distributors, they've been hearing more from their clients, and certainly larger distributors with larger clients, that they have a mandate to diversify their spend, to spend with either minority-owned suppliers, women-owned suppliers, suppliers who check certain boxes for those mandates. And I think you're going to find those more in smaller suppliers and more of the upstart suppliers. Now, large suppliers have done a good job of adding brand names that have those certifications, that have charitable givebacks. So larger suppliers have done their job, certainly, but there are smaller suppliers in the market who can meet those needs of those larger buyers.
For sure. And before we go on to this, I just want to talk about one slide at the bottom here.
Yeah.
The points at the bottom about whether or not suppliers and distributors feel communication between them and their counterparts on the other side of the aisle, so to speak, is strong, right? Here's why I want to point this out. Let's say you're a distributor and you feel that the communication that you're having between you and your suppliers is poor, right? I want to make this clear, then realize that that's not the norm, right? That means that there's a disconnect happening somewhere between you and your suppliers. And the same goes obviously for suppliers and distributors. There's a disconnect somewhere. And it's sort of like it's not always one person's issue. It could be on both. So just take a look at that and realize that the vast majority of distributors and the vast majority of suppliers feel that the communication that they have with their counterparts is strong. And if yours isn't, or you don't feel it is, then maybe take a look at who you're dealing with or how you're dealing with each other and try to make improvements, because that should not be the norm.
Well, I'm glad you brought up that stat. So yeah, 3/4 of distributors and basically 3/4 of suppliers feel that the communication is strong with their supply chain counterparts. To me, I liken it to my parents, right? They've been married for 40 years. They'll complain about each other, but they stay married, right? It's the same thing with distributors and suppliers. I'm not saying there aren't issues that can't be addressed and improved, but overall, like, the bond is strong. It's the bond that makes this whole industry operate, and so overall, it's the connection is still there.
Yep.
So we were talking about suppliers, and one of the key thing is supply chain disruption. It was obviously a huge headache in 21 and 22, and we saw improvement in 23. And you can tell that just by all the different metrics. So concerns about supply chain disruptions way down. Percentage of on-time orders went from 84% to 89%. That's a 5% increase in just 1 year. 80%, 88% of orders were delivered from suppliers without errors or mistakes. So these are all very positive signs. There has been some supply chain disruption recently, issues in the Red Sea, container prices are going up. I will stress that I think perspective is needed. Yes, those prices are increasing, but they're also far below the worst of the post-pandemic supply chain disruption. And I think you agree, Nate, there's still a lot of encouraging signs in terms of the supply chain settling down.
CJ, straight up, I love it when numbers actually change from year to year, right? Like, there's so many times when I do analysis where it's like I'm basically reporting things like, well, it's kind of the same, nothing much changed, yada yada yada, to quote Seinfeld, right? But when you look at the extremely concerned about supply chain disruptions, that has changed remarkably just over the last 2 years of the study. When the 2022 SOI, 72% of distributors said they were extremely concerned about it. That's stepped down all the way to 13%, right? And same thing with suppliers, 48% stepped down to 12%. The on-time orders, as you mentioned, 84 to 89, that's a big jump in 1 year, right? So it's sort of like, you're never going to get to 100% on that. I mean, I would love to say that you're going to, but I mean, we don't live in, like, Shangri-La here. So, but that's a big improvement, and that's such positive movement for this, which has kind of seen a slide from 2019. So, I am very encouraged by these, and even if you look down below, in the bottom left on the screen, percentage of distributors who ranked meeting end buyer deadlines as their most difficult challenge. It kind of makes sense, right? That in 2022, when everybody was concerned about supply chains, 16% of distributors rated as their number one most difficult challenge. That's now down to 4% in 24. So things are very, very much moving in what I consider to be a very positive direction.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's a key point in maybe the schism that suppliers and distributors had like a couple of years ago, is that products were just not either arriving on time, not arriving at all, or inventory was just disappearing, and it was creating a lot of problems. And I think when the supply chain is stronger, that makes life a lot easier for distributors and suppliers to work together. But I will note there's one sort of wrinkle that is causing a little bit of controversy, a little bit of concern, and it's the percentage of distributors who are basically sourcing direct. So sourcing outside of the U.S. and Canada, going directly to overseas factories. It's gone up the past couple of years. It went from 47% in 2022. In 2024, 6 in 10 distributors are sourcing directly, and then the concern of suppliers, of feeling of knowing that distributors are sourcing direct and whether that's a threat to the supplier business is going up as well.
Yep.
And like that's a trend that just can't be ignored. It's not saying that distributors are not placing orders with suppliers at all. It's just that distributors of all kinds, small, medium, and large, do feel more comfortable sourcing direct.
Yeah, and so yes, right, for sure. One thing that you just want to be make clear though is that's not saying 61% of distributors are sourcing all of their business,
Correct.
right? Like they're sourcing a reasonably small percentage of it. Now, should suppliers be concerned about it? I think I would be, right, if I was them. But I think that that's where you want to connect with your customers and find out, or do why they're doing it, and maybe just do an internal analysis about what is the value that you're adding or that you could add, that would discourage or make it better for distributors to not source direct. Because listen, it's a lot more stress, it's a lot more headaches, it's a lot more uncertainty unless you have really, really strong relationships, which is I consider to be, especially for like small and mid-sized distributors, probably going to be rarely the case, right? I would look at this as saying, yes, it's happening. No, you can't stop it from happening, because you just can't. That's not the way the free market works. But what you can do is you can look at what is the value add that your services are providing, and see if there's a way that the cost benefit of a distributor going directly can be offset by the services you're providing them, whether or not they're perceived actual, and it can be monetary. It could also be stress. It could be ease of doing business. It could be making sure and making it clear to distributors that you'll handle all of the stuff in a way that they can't because of your relationships. Just, you can bemoan it that it's happening, and I get it, right? That's a natural human emotion, but also realize that, in the way that like Amazon back in the day, all the booksellers were complaining about Amazon. Yeah, but then you have to find a way to like, maybe what else could you offer?
Yeah, and you're right. We hear from distributors just anecdotally, they're sourcing direct when they need to, when they need to make up that margin. Only in select cases. They're not doing it all the time. And the bedrock of that supplier distributor relationship, and a way I think for suppliers to either stem that trend is to be there for the distributor in those select cases where, like, hey, we can work with you, we can get you that order, we can work on the margin, we can lay the groundwork for a larger relationship by being flexible on that order. But it's a complicated, thorny issue, and we're not professing to have all the answers for
No,
sure.
we're not.
One last thing just to talk about. So a lot of information about where suppliers are importing their products from. And there's all this information is also, again, in our report. I think just the biggest takeaway that I took from all of this is that a couple of years ago, there was a huge hue and cry about getting out of China. We can't be so reliant on China. We need to find other places to make our products. I'm not saying that isn't happening. I do think suppliers and some select large distributors are looking elsewhere. But I think the urgency has changed. Before it was, we must get out of China. Now it's, we'd like to get out of China, but maybe when it's convenient for us, and we're not in any particular rush. And I think that's reflected in just how reliant companies still are on China.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, it was a problem when COVID was shutting down cities in China. It was a problem when you couldn't get materials into and or out of ports. Right. So everybody's, running around with their hair on fire, so to speak, saying we need to explore all the alternatives. But it's not easy to do that. Right. And there's issues, there's challenges. You have, the relationship with China that the US and, North American suppliers has been, wound up over 40 years. Right. It's not easy to unwind that. Like I feel like as a country we made a decision 40, 50 years ago that we're okay with all of this moving over to China. All of these, and I'm not talking only promotional products, right? I'm talking about like a lot of manufacturing.
Right.
So if you want to unwind it, that's fine if you want. And I think it's great to be diversified. I think it's highly important to be diversified. as an industry with our supply chain. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take determination, I guess you can say, and that's sort of waned a little bit from 2020 and onward.
Yeah. One thing that bears watching, though, is the election, because you have two candidates who have different policies and different ideas about how to monitor the trade situation with China. And I think tariffs are going to continue with China. It's just a matter of how aggressively there are. So that will certainly influence the relationship.
Yep.
All right, one last thing. So this is not from our stated industry report. This is from the quarterly sales survey that Nate administers. And we just released our data for Q2 and how the industry is doing. And it was up 1.3%. And that follows Q1, where it was down negative 0.9%. So Nate, using this data, give us a snapshot for the first half of the year and what happened, and then what portends for the second half of the year.
What portends? I love portend. I haven't used portends in a sentence in a long time. Listen, you can kind of see the line here, right? Growth has slowed dramatically from the post-COVID recovery, right? And let's be clear, from a sales point of view, this industry has recovered from where COVID was. 2019, we were at 25.8. Now we're at 26.1. This industry has made back that ground. Now, that's in terms of sales, right? I don't believe this industry has made back that ground in terms of overall product orders or that, because prices are so much higher now than they were in 2019. So I still think there's a lot of upward growth possibility that hasn't been fully realized yet. But what I would also say is that I was coming out of Q4 last year. I mean, if you look at these numbers for Q1 and Q2 of 23, it was up just about under 5% year over year. That's pretty strong growth. Then it kind of just cratered, and Q4 was so much worse than people were anticipating.
Yeah.
So from a perception point of view, that's really the challenge that the industry had to overcome. And it continued on into Q1. Q2 was slightly improved, right? Which is good. My gut, CJ, is telling me that it's going to continue to improve a bit in Q3 and Q4. I especially consider that a possibility because Q3 and Q4 last year were fairly weak, right? So the sales we're measuring are year over year. So I do think you're going to see growth. Well, I think it's going to get to the loss of 13.5%. No, I don't. But I think you're going to see improvement. So my gut tells me that as once the presidential election is over as well in the US, that will be sort of a boost to the industry, no matter who wins, by the way. I don't think that necessarily matters. I think it's uncertainty kind of like takes over people's minds. I think if this was going to be a landslide in one way or another, it would be much easier and people could kind of put it out of their minds. It's been a long time since we had that in America. So what I think you're going to see, though, is as that sort of bypasses and goes away, and then, but even moving forward, I think after the most recent stock market activity, that's going to settle down and people will be like, that's what we've been waiting for. Maybe it wasn't as bad. It's a correction, but it may not be as bad as it was. And I hope when I watch this again in a month, if I watch it, that actually holds true. That when all of that happens, spending will increase. And I think that there's sort of been, brakes put on spending by a lot of companies. And I think they're going to have to come off very, very soon.
Yeah, definitely the uncertainty around the election is something we've been hearing a lot from both distributors and suppliers. And something you said earlier, I think is key. The fact that budgets are tight and clients are waiting to spend it, but they still need to spend it.
Yeah.
And so you're going to see a cascading effect where if they weren't spending in Q1 and Q2, that's going to spill over into Q3 and Q4. And so combined with the fact that last year's Q3 and Q4 weren't that great, I think you're going to see some relatively positive numbers. We're not anticipating major growth, but I think you're going to see some encouraging signs for the closeout of the year. Cautious optimism is the term that that I've been using and that I've been told. And I think that's just the overall vibe that the industry is projecting for the rest of the year.
I concur, sir.
So okay, let's wrap up here, Nate. For our viewers and our listeners, what are the key takeaways and key thoughts you want to leave them with as it pertains to our State of the Industry report?
Make sure that take some time. And I know everybody's really, really busy, right? Everybody, I mean, especially God knows nowadays, right? Everybody's running around, and you don't think you have time to do it. You have to make that next phone call. You have to make that next sales call. You got to do this. Take some time to sit down with this report. Take some time to read through it. The most important thing I think people can do for their business is to take some time to actually learn about it and learn about, not just worry about their day-to-day operations, but take into account a bigger picture and see what else is happening. And this issue of the magazine of Counselor is the best resource in the industry on an annual basis to do that. So what I would say is take it in, read it over, and then actually be honest with yourself about what position your business is in and how it can improve based on what you're going to learn from this, because you will learn from this.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nate, for taking the time to go over all this with us. So thank you, everybody.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everybody, for listening, for viewing. Once again, reminder, you can find our full report. Again, it's in the summer issue of Counselor, and also online, www.stateoftheindustry.com. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your week.